Welcome to another Bright News discussion. And I'm here with a special guest. He's been on before. So without further ado, I'm here with Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds. So, Dr. Reynolds, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me on again. Happy to be speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, well, I just want I think last week we ended off on, we may have talked about, uh, nascent Islam and the Quran.
Hmm.
So I just
Hmm.
want to pick back up on some of the following questions that I had. So the first question is about the first Hijra, relating to the companions of the Prophet and how they fled to Abyssinia, or at the time, I guess, what was known as Aksum. So I guess my question is, how is this a story? Is there a memory of this? Is this a historical um, period of time, or
Right,
is this more of a, you
right.
know, yeah, yeah? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I don't think it's historical. I know it's terrible. It's terrible to argue that because it's a beautiful story, right? And
Right.
I mean, nevertheless, even if I'm right, and
Hmm.
it never took place, there never was a first hijrah of some of Muhammad's followers from Mecca to the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, as you said, Aksum, Abyssinia. Even if that never took place, that the story was written is still important, right? Because it was Muslims who would have written that story, and I can, make sort of a best guess on how that would have kind of taken place. Like, what were the components that they used
Right.
to develop that story? What were the reasons for it? But I mean, nevertheless, it was Muslims who developed this story, and it's a beautiful story of respect between the first Muslims and the Christian kingdom. Ethiopia historically now was one of the first, if not the first, Christian state
Hmm.
in history. Sometimes people say Armenia and Ethiopia sort of compete. Obviously, Christianity has its beginnings in the first century, but in terms of like a state, empire, kingdom, formally adopting sort of from top down Christianity, Ethiopia is one of the first, if not the first. So it is, there is actually a rich history of Christianity. And certainly by the time that Islam comes on the scene, Ethiopia was principally Christian. We could
Hmm.
speak more about, the distinctive nature of Ethiopian Christianity. But in terms of the story, I mean, the logic of the story is that from a Muslim point of view, is that the Muslims were enduring such difficult persecution from the pagan tribe that dominated Mecca that the Prophet decided to safeguard some of his followers by sending them off across the Red Sea, kind of southwest from
Hmm.
Mecca to Ethiopia, Abyssinia, where he was confident that Christians there, as fellow monotheists, whereas the Quraysh, the tribe in Mecca, were polytheists, Christians there would welcome them and protect them. So, I mean, in terms of like why one is skeptical that it really took place, I mean, part of it has to do with understanding the nature or the typical mechanism by which these sorts of stories were produced in early Islamic literature. But another point, I mean, a big one, is that there's just no mention of it in any Ethiopian text, no
Okay.
reference to anything like this. So we just have a story from Muslims, the origins of the story, or the beginning of the biographical literature. So they're basically, early ninth century Muslim accounts of something that might have happened in the Meccan period, so between 610 and 622. I just add one more thing. I've probably spoken too long,
No
too long
problem.
already.
Yeah.
But I mean, so in terms of the mechanisms by which this kind of story is produced, um, I mean, a lot of the, if not all of the biography of the Prophet is meant to actually be an argument that Muhammad really was a prophet. And it's often produced by expanding on references or allusions in the Quran. So Quran comes first,
Hmm.
the biography of the Prophet comes second.
Hmm.
And the biography is kind of the biographers are looking at the Quran and developing material, turns of phrase in there. So
Hmm.
I mean, on the one hand, in that in the Quran, we have in Quran chapter 5 two really key verses. One is verse 82, which says that the Christians are closest in friendship, whereas the pagans are greatest in enmity. So that kind of
Okay.
sets the scene, right? So a story where you leave the pagans, go to the Christians. The very next verse, chapter 5, verse 83, says that the Christians, when they hear what was revealed to Muhammad, they begin to cry. Their eyes
Mm-hmm.
fill with tears. As
Mm-hmm.
part of the account, by tradition, the migrants who went to Ethiopia recited a bit of Quran chapter 19,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Ethiopian Christians began to cry. Of course, the
Yeah.
Negus, we could speak more about him, sort of the ruler there is a central figure.
Yes.
But then, yeah, I mean, then there are various references to the nature of pilgrimage or hijra, as a response to persecution. Fitna is the Arabic word there, for
Mm-hmm.
persecution, and that, this is what you should do. The Quran, says this is what you should do. And so, I mean, naturally, the people writing the biography would say, well, if the Quran says this is what you should do,
Mm-hmm.
when you're facing persecution, then certainly Muhammad would have been attentive to that. And faced with persecution, he would have sent his followers out on migration.
So he's saying that like you should apply this same method if you come across these sort of complications, you should
Exactly.
act the same way. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and that has implications. It might take us to another direction,
Yeah.
but that has implications also for later Islamic thinking
Mm-hmm.
about how to deal with living in a non-Islamic land.
Mm-hmm.
So this interesting development, especially in the 20th, 21st century, when you have large Muslim migration to the West, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So they have to wrestle with this principle because it's in the Quran, you should migrate, but then, people nevertheless are going to lands where the majority population is not Islamic. How do you
Right.
justify that? So anyway, there are other kinds of implications not related to the question of the Ethiopia story.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. Great. I'm glad I got an answer for that. I've been sitting on that for a long time to get for as a question.
I mean,
So,
people will contest that. It's really difficult, and I feel kind of bad even just saying straightforward my assessment of it because, I mean, the story comes up always in meetings between
mhm,
Muslims and Christians. Sometimes the
mhm,
meetings start that way. There's a couple, there's like three or four stories people tell,
yeah.
to sort of like inculcate a spirit of friendship in that.
Yeah.
So it sounds horrible to be like, oh, it never happened. So,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it
It
is what
is
it is, I
it
guess.
it 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 is a message of solidarity or
Yeah, it still is, definitely.
communal, like, respect or reciprocity or
Yeah.
something like that.
And
Yeah.
like I
Mhm.
said, sorry to jump in again, but
No, no.
that the story was written at all, well, that's still meaningful, right? It was Muslims.
Mhm,
I mean, even if you take my approach, my skeptical
mhm,
approach, it still
mhm.
was Muslims who wrote that story. So it is sort of a gesture of goodwill.
Yes, yes. Okay. Okay. Now, uh, I wanna get into something that you actually wrote, uh, I don't know how long ago this was, but, it was a paper on or you wrote a paper on, that correct me if I'm wrong, that the argument you were making was that the Quran, um, regarding the death of Christ or the crucifixion of Christ
Mhm, mhm,
was, uh, it has come to be read that Christ was actually not crucified on the cross,
mhm, mhm,
but was
mhm.
replaced by someone else.
Right.
And you are arguing that the Quran actually affirms the crucifixion and death of Christ. Am I
Yes.
correct
Yeah.
about that? Okay. Can you
Yeah.
just give us a short little, a short summary of like why maybe in layman terms, I can't, understand
Yeah.
Arabic,
Yeah.
why that would be the case? Why?
Yeah. So, yeah, this is one of the things I wrote, I know about 15 years ago that I actually still stand by. A lot
Okay.
of things I'm like, why
Okay.
did I write that? Can I have it back? But this is an argument I still think is correct.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I mean, so for the crucifixion of Christ himself, there's only one direct reference.
Mm,
It's in Quran chapter 4, verse 157. Anyone who wants to look that up,
mm,
um, and very difficult because it's just ambiguous.
okay.
So it doesn't say that Jesus was not crucified. It doesn't say that Jesus was not killed. It
Mhm,
says that the Israelites did not crucify um, and did not kill
mhm.
Jesus.
Okay.
So
Mhm,
that's difficult. And then it goes on to say that instead, what happened was, and this is where you get the difficult Arabic, which we don't have to get into, but it's an expression that can either mean someone was made to look like Jesus,
Mhm.
or it could mean like the whole affair was basically a confusion for the Israelites.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
what?
there's that verb. It
Yeah.
basically has two meanings, like
Okay.
to appear
And
like something else,
mhm.
or to be a confusion. So,
Okay.
and I could go into more what I think are the reasons why the
Okay.
interpretation developed as it did, but the vast majority of Muslim scholars argue that it's the someone who's made to look like Jesus interpretation that's correct.
Okay. Mhm.
And so, there are many narrations,
Mhm.
different in different kinds of Islamic literature
Mhm.
about God making someone else look like Jesus.
Mhm.
This other guy is taken and crucified. Meanwhile, Jesus is taken directly, body and soul, to heaven.
Okay.
And that's connected to the following verse, chapter 4, verse 158, which speaks about God raising Jesus to heaven. And
Okay.
there are some pretty interesting implications for that, because this is the principle that leads to the Islamic teaching that in the end times, Jesus will return.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
not Muhammad.
Right.
Muhammad will not return. He's dead. So
Mhm.
that part of his sort of role within God's relationship to the world is over, but not
Mhm.
Jesus. Jesus is alive. He's just
Mhm.
in heaven,
Mhm.
and so he will return.
Mhm.
Was really interesting, right? Because
Yes.
for example, one interesting point is that Islamic teaching is very adamant that Muhammad is the last prophet,
Mhm.
and there's this phrase seal of the prophets.
Mhm.
um but that's kind of compromised by this other teaching that Jesus actually is going to come back after Muhammad, so in a certain way Jesus is the last prophet for Muslims.
Yes.
So
Okay.
it's all very confusing and complicated, but anyway, my
Yeah.
argument basically is that if you take all the evidence of the Quran
Mhm.
um, into account,
Mhm.
then there's good reason to think that what's meant with that ambiguous verb in the key verse is actually the confusion meaning.
Okay.
And the
Mhm.
reason why
Mhm.
everything is confusing to the Israelites, I don't really have a like absolutely compelling argument,
Mhm.
but I would say the preponderance of evidence suggests that what the Quran is getting at is that God Himself made Jesus die, and then after his death took Jesus to himself, raised him to himself after Jesus' death.
Mhm.
That God is responsible for death and for life,
Mhm.
and the Israelites were unaware that it was not actually them. They thought that they were killing Jesus, but they were actually sort of participating in God's plan.
Yeah.
And so the ultimate, like the I don't know, the principal cause of Jesus' death was actually God, not the Israelites.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Okay. That kind of, I read about I don't know if you've ever heard of Rene Girard
Yes,
and
yes.
his whole idea of the scapegoat and everything.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
he argues that his whole thing is like humans are the actual agents in the death of Christ, and with all scapegoats, right? And so that I suppose that has a Christians say, well, God is not the author of Jesus crucifixion. Some
Mhm,
Christians would say that. I
mhm,
suppose some Christians would also say no, God is the one punishing Jesus for the sins of mankind, something like
mhm,
that.
mhm,
There's
mhm.
different theological arguments.
Right,
So,
right.
yes, yeah,
Well,
I can.
I think that's actually a really, really important point in this
Mhm,
context because,
mhm,
some Muslims might say, like, okay, Reynolds, you think you're, making this big sort of splashy argument, about the crucifixion, but, actually, it's just not a big deal for us.
mhm,
It usually is not part of our sermons on Friday.
mhm,
It's just Muslims aren't talking about this a lot. It's always Christians that get interested in it.
mhm,
Islam is ultimately about Muhammad.
mhm,
So crucified, not crucified, it's not really a big deal. And I think basically, I see the coherence of that argument, right? So it's just the crucifixion is not a big deal, and even more generally, the idea of atonement, which is
mhm,
so central to Christian theology,
mhm,
is just There may be some hints at it in the Quran itself, but the way that
Mhm.
Islam develops is just not a central principle of Islam.
Right. It doesn't take any it doesn't take precedence over anything.
Exactly, exactly. I
Yes.
would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now, this is another. Now that we're in Advent and in Christmas, I wanted to ask you something about uh, the surah or the Quranic passages that refer to the ascent and descent of angels
Mhm, mhm.
and Ramadan's days of white and its relationship to the nativity story and is there something about Christmas in the Quran with that? I remember Stephen Shoemaker and Guillaume D were I'm not sure if they were alluding to this or making this argument that there's some sort of that passage is may have been referring to the Christmas story, but then it got redacted. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? I'm
Yes,
trying
yes,
to.
100%.
I'm
Yeah, yeah,
trying not to
100%.
sound over
No,
my
no,
head. But
100%.
yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Okay.
So that is still sort of a key debate. So yeah, I mean, just sort of the some of the starting points for that debate. Just as you said, they relate around language, especially in Quran 97. So one of those short chapters at the end
Mhm,
about, as you said, Shannon, like angels coming down on a blessed night.
mhm,
Quran 97 speaks about the night of destiny. Uh,
mhm,
in Arabic, it's qadr. Sometimes it's translated as the night of destiny.
mhm, mhm.
And, exactly as you said, Muslims interpret it as an allusion to the descent of the Quran.
Okay. Mhm.
We kind of take another step back and kind
Yes.
of unravel that a bit because the standard Islamic belief is that God sort of revealed the Quran in two stages.
Mhm.
First, in a kind of like supernatural, well, it's all supernatural, maybe
Yes.
metaphysical
Yeah.
way. He sent the angel Gabriel from the highest heaven to the lowest heaven
Mhm.
with the heavenly Quran.
Okay.
Now,
Mhm,
Muslims will debate about was it a real book? Was it a physical book? This
mhm,
heavenly Quran? Does it just mean, is it kind of symbolic? Is it something in between? Like
mhm,
there really was an angel who kind
mhm,
of entered into the worldly um, uh, sphere,
mhm,
but not with a physical book. There are all kinds of positions on it. Anyway, so
mhm,
that's kind of the first stage.
mhm.
And this is where you see some iconography in old like illuminated Qurans, where you'll see an angel literally carrying a book.
Okay.
So that
Mhm,
that refers to that. But of course, Islamic tradition is not like, for example, what Latter-day Saints
mhm,
would say about the Book of Mormon, if I get that correct. Like they don't believe the angel actually handed over a book
mhm,
to Muhammad. They
mhm.
believe that Gabriel gave some, what we could call oral messages. So he
Mhm.
spoke one way or another. There's also debates on that. What does that mean?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
more or less spoke messages to Muhammad. And so, it was the first stage of revelation, didn't really have implications for Muhammad.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
that's the night being referred to, the descent of the Quran, according to chapter 97. The second
okay.
stage has to do with the angel's periodic visits to Muhammad, where he would more or less speak the words
Mhm,
to the Prophet that would become the Quran. I don't know
mhm.
if that was clear enough. I think I kind of muddled
Yes. No,
the whole
yes.
thing.
Yes.
But to
Yes.
to try to connect it to Quran 97 and the debate around Christmas in the Quran, I mean, the
Mhm,
language is very suggestive in Quran 97. By suggestive, I mean it's close to language, I guess, especially in Luke's gospel. Might be some of it connected to more Matthew. I should get those
mhm,
two disentangled from my mind. But yeah, so it speaks of we brought it down on we brought it down on a night, or could be him,
mhm,
potentially him. The Arabic pronoun doesn't differentiate between it and him,
mhm,
which is better than alfi shahr, 1,000 months. And
mhm.
then it speaks of the angels coming down, and then at the end, the very last verse, I think, of that chapter says, "And peace be upon something until the coming of dawn."
Okay.
So the language is very suggestive of sort of Christmas language.
mhm.
not only in Matthew and Luke, but presumably within the liturgical life of the church. Maybe even more importantly, the different hymns and
Yes.
liturgical prayers that were developed around the celebration of Christmas.
Okay.
So, if you're convinced that there's something Christmassy
Mhm,
about this chapter, then you sort of have two options. One is to say, well, this chapter really is speaking about Jesus and
mhm,
Christmas. So this
mhm.
was this article by Christoph Luxemburg, and then later, just as you said, Shannon, Dee and maybe Shoemaker also spoke about Christmas in the Quran. So that
Mhm,
could be one option. I would go with the second option, which no, it really is referring to itself, the
mhm.
descent of the Quran, but it is borrowing, or maybe to be a little more edgy,
Mhm.
appropriating um, Christian language for
Okay.
its own message about the Quran.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, and I suppose that's not unheard of. Other religious groups appropriate text,
Yeah,
earlier texts, and earlier
yeah. I
things.
mean, in a way, I guess I don't know what you would say about this, but
Mhm,
some of the New Testament, like the gospel quotations of Hebrew
mhm.
Bible material, could be seen as a similar sort of move. Or
Certainly. Yes. Yes. Okay. Okay. So, um, can we say anything about the hadith? So I assume the hadith or the biographies of the prophet, his life and
Mhm,
ministry and
mhm,
death and everything. Um, you know, I think I remember. I don't remember if you had said this in a previous podcast that you run yourself, that you do, where or if someone was asking you this
mhm,
about the hadith and their I guess their what would you say, their accuracy, like are the hadiths um primary sources, are people seeing the prophet do this, or are these hadiths being written, centuries later or
mhm, mhm,
long period of time. I remember, this argument that, in the I suppose the 19th and early 20th century,
mhm,
there were a
mhm,
lot of European scholars that thought that was authentic. These were authentic biographies that were being written in the prophet's time, and sort of now that sort of been flipped, and people say, well, actually, maybe they're a little later, and that they're not even
mhm, mhm.
they weren't even written when the prophet was alive. So, yeah, I mean, if you could just maybe,
Yeah,
just
yeah.
yeah, mhm,
Academically, it's a really, really difficult problem, and yeah,
yeah,
there's a big spectrum between
okay,
hadith skeptics and uh, extreme hadith skeptics like me.
okay, yes, mhm,
So I'm extremely skeptical,
mhm,
and then there are a lot of scholars who have a project of rehabilitating
mhm,
the authenticity or the arguments for authenticity of the hadith. I
mhm,
mean, a couple of things, maybe just background. First of all, you know, uh, the Quran itself says, it's a book that is a sort of maybe closest in terms of biblical literature, closest to the Psalms, right? So it's sort
okay,
of hymnic, has a hymnic quality.
mhm,
Um, it's meant to sort of convince you to believe, so it
mhm,
gives you tells stories or uses language that's meant to
mhm,
inspire in you submission to God, acceptance of the prophet, desire for paradise. In other
mhm,
passages, which are meant to inculcate fear,
mhm,
fear of God's punishment in this life and the next life.
mhm, mhm,
So it's just not the kind of book that gives details about,
right,
where, when, why, who. Like
yeah,
you get very
yeah,
few proper nouns, names, very
mhm,
few chronological sort of anchors that would allow
mhm,
you to situate yourself.
mhm,
Things don't run in a chronological order, kind of, go back and forth between different times.
mhm,
So you can't. It's almost impossible with the Quran alone
mhm,
to tell the story of Muhammad's life.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Um, so, but then you have the hadith. So you have the second body of literature, which is a really important question. I'm glad you brought this up, which tells you everything about
Mm-hmm.
Muhammad's life.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, like the hadith will tell you stories about other prophets too, some of
Yes.
which are close to things in the Bible, some of things are not. I'll
Yeah.
also tell you about, I don't know, the life of Muhammad's grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib.
Mm-hmm.
Like there'll be those stories will be in the hadith.
Yes.
So you just get everything there to the point that, as you said, Shannon, like there was a very famous French scholar from the early 19th century named Renan, mispronounced it the first time, Renan. And,
Okay.
he famously said, well, Islam is not like Christianity. Islam was born in the full light of history. And the
Okay.
reason why I had that famous line about the full light of history was, he was looking at the hadith with all of its details. What did
Mm-hmm.
Muhammad eat? For example, a hadith says three things. There are three things that I love: perfume, women, and prayer. Other hadith says, he didn't like to wear silk clothes. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't like garlic.
Mm-hmm.
He used to go on running races against his young wife, Aisha. I mean,
Okay.
he used to put on his right sandal before his left. He used to, make sure to shave or pluck his armpit hairs. I mean,
Okay.
like everything you could possibly know about a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Renault looked at this and he was like, "Oh, this is not like Jesus. We don't know what Jesus wore, what
Right.
Jesus ate, except for fish, maybe." And
Right.
so he was like, "Oh, this is great. We actually have information about a religious founder."
Yes.
The problem is, and I've already spoken too long, so I won't go into depth about this.
It's okay.
First of all, the first books that contain hadith are late,
Mm-hmm.
and Muslims say, yeah, but hadith have these reports of the men and women who provided an oral transmission, either
Mm-hmm.
from Muhammad or from an eyewitness of someone who saw something Muhammad did. And
Mm-hmm.
these lists of names tell us that before the writing down of the hadith, there was a an oral transmission.
Okay.
And Muslims will say, listen, we know that some hadith are not authentic, sorry, and they
Mm-hmm.
have to say that because there are so many conflicting hadith, and
Mm-hmm.
even a hadith that doesn't conflict may be in like 10 or 15 different varieties with different variations, some longer on the same thing that apparently really happened.
Mm-hmm.
There might be 10 or 15 versions of this
Yeah.
that may not conflict directly. Anyway, there's lots and lots of problems about the hadith. Also don't want to, I don't know, be too punchy or
Yeah.
provoke anyone, because the
Sure.
truth is that in Islam, hadith are super important because they lead to the formation in a special way of the law.
Okay.
So
Mm-hmm.
practice,
Mm-hmm.
like everything Muslims are taught is, obligatory or forbidden or permitted. That's built, 90% of it is built on the hadith. So,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't, I mean, if you did away with the hadith, you're doing away with the things Muslims do,
Right.
like the hijab or circumcision. These are
Right.
not in the Quran,
Right.
in any way resembling what how they're understood by Muslims today. So
Okay.
you can't, yeah. So it's a big problem, and it's another, like the Ethiopia thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like me as a skeptical non-Muslim scholar. These are my sort of honest, sober opinions about these things, but at the same time, like I respect how important these are.
Mm-hmm.
And I can even imagine, as kind of a thought experiment, how a
Mm-hmm.
Muslim could run with my skepticism, but still find a theological meaning in the hadith. But it's not my job to do that work on behalf of Muslims. So,
Yeah. 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 I understand. Okay. Okay. So, um, the one of the things I want to ask about, like, historical criticism when it
mhm,
comes to Islam and the Quran, has that been ha- has the Muslim world been receptive to that, or has it has it been more of a I guess, is it more critical, like they're resistant to it,
mhm,
or do you find that it varies from say, one country to another, or depending on your, I guess, theological framework, or
Right, right.
someone might say, depending on maybe the madhab you belong to, or
Exactly.
something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
did
great question. I mean, I think a key point actually, people might not imagine that this is how I would start answering
mhm,
this really important question, but a key point is actually kind of take a step back, just to have a sort of appreciation for the nature of many Muslim majority societies. Of course,
mhm,
we're all very different from each other. I was
mhm,
corresponding recently with someone from Turkey, and he's like,
mhm,
listen, things are not like Arab countries here. Of course,
mhm,
within Arab countries, Tunisia is not like Egypt, which is not like Iraq or Saudi Arabia or
right,
whatever. So there
yeah,
are a lot of differences. But for many Muslim majority countries, the culture is sort of soaked through with Islam. You see
mhm,
this in manners of speech, God and the Prophet is in all kinds
mhm,
of turns of phrase. But in a
mhm,
more profound way, the whole fabric of society, Islam is sort of woven through it, to use that
mhm,
metaphor. And
mhm,
so, in a sense, like I don't want to make it seem like Big Brother or something, but
mhm,
people are watching, right? So there's an expectation that you should model or even perform Islam in a public way.
mhm,
If you're really part of the society, are you really Egyptian? Are you really Pakistani? You
mhm,
know, um, you should love the Prophet. You should love Islam. Listen, there
mhm,
are enemies of Islam out there. The
mhm,
West is out to get us. Maybe, unfortunately, they might say the Jews are out to get us.
mhm,
They might say like this or that teaching, maybe Darwin, evolution, whatever
mhm,
is meant to undermine Islam. They might even say like notions of women's liberation or even
mhm,
Western ideas of human rights, civil rights. These are out to
mhm,
undermine Islam. And you hear a lot of this stuff. I mean, sometimes the most extreme stuff is what's popular on the internet. So you
mhm,
shouldn't trust what you find on YouTube if you're looking
right,
at Muslim content as
right,
a simple reflection of what's popular in Muslim majority countries. But
mhm,
this kind of stuff is really, I mean, it's on Friday sermons. Some of the most influential Muslim thinkers take something like Qaradawi, the great,
mhm,
Egyptian, died in 2022.
okay,
Major, probably, the biggest star of second half of the 20th, first half of the 21st century in the
mhm,
Sunni world. I mean, he uses this rhetoric all the time.
okay,
And so, that I just kind of start with that as a preliminary note because it's just important to note like there's this sort of vigilance against plots against Islam, things
mhm,
like that. In like some of the vehemence against folks they call Orientalists.
mhm,
It's there's almost like a reflex reaction that
mhm,
any non-Muslim writing about Islam is part of this greater, front. Uh,
mhm,
yeah, so,
okay,
yeah, when Reynolds, guy with the name Reynolds,
yeah,
writes this or that thing about skepticism of the Hadith or the
yeah,
migration to Ethiopia never took place, they would
mhm.
like this is not his sober analysis of the sources. Um,
This
you
is a
know,
trying to undermine
yeah,
or subvert. Yeah, okay. I
totally.
I
Now, I just want to add one more thing to that. It's really important to note, however, a trend among Muslims in the West principally
mhm,
of like enthusiastic participation in academic discussions of Islam. So
yeah,
especially in the last 10, 15 years, I would say the leading figures of not my generation, the younger generation of
mhm,
historical critical scholars. I'm not speaking about imams and stuff.
mhm,
Historical critical scholars in Islamic studies, some of whom are Muslim believers themselves, and they just make it work. They do both.
mhm,
Others, are not, at least, not in any traditional way,
mhm,
believers. But,
mhm,
just name a few of the really leading lights of academic scholarship of Islam that, come from Muslim heritage. Muhsin Gudarzi and Shadi Nasser at Harvard University,
okay,
both doing the most cutting edge work on the
mhm,
Quran in different fields.
mhm,
Saqib Hussein, who teaches at a Catholic school in California, Loyola Marymount, graduated
okay,
from Oxford. And Mehdi Azayas, he's in Europe. Imran al-Bedawi in Texas. I mean, so many of the new up and coming generation of scholars in the West are from a Muslim heritage. So
okay.
there's that as well.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I listened to I tried to listen to Dr. Mehdi Azayas on his counter discourse. He gave a lecture at, I think, at Leiden University or something like that in
Yeah,
Belgium.
yeah.
Yeah, I tried to follow that. Kind of hard, but yeah, yeah. I have to listen to him more. So thank you for bringing those up. Yeah.
And the head, I mean, one more brilliant scholar from Muslim background, the head of the International Quranic Studies Association is Haytham Sidki. I don't know if you've
Okay.
seen him. He's on the internet quite a bit.
Yes, I
Brilliant
have. Yeah.
scholar, also from Muslim background. So,
Okay. Okay. Great. Great. All right. I got a number of things to listen to. So that's cool. Okay. Um, so now you've just recently written your own book of fiction, I believe, right?
yeah.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, if you can. But I wanted to actually get your take on the fact that I don't know if you're a fan of Dune, uh, but Dune actually has some uh, what seems to be some Islamic
Hmm. Hmm.
overturns or
Hmm.
some foundations there.
Even in the words, right, or the names that are used for
Yeah,
certain
yeah,
characters, or
yeah. They call him Muhadib. They say Shai Hulud. They call the worm Shai Hulud. So you know, I just wanted to maybe get your take on the fact that, like, what do you think about, I mean, the author who wrote Dune is, of course, he's passed, and he wrote those books, I think, even before I was born. But he was using, I think, a sort of eschatology that was Islamic, of a Mahdi, or someone that was going to return
yeah,
at the end of the
yeah, yeah,
age, and
interesting. Yeah.
and stuff like that. So I wonder, if you know anything about that. What is your take on that? Like, do you think that's sort of giving people a window into how Muslims think in terms of, like, the end of days, eschatology, the apocalypse, and stuff like that? And is that sort of a healthy way to sort of get people to be a little more interested, I guess, in faith in general, in
Yeah.
religion? Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
super cool. Yeah, all right. So I'm going to lean heavily on the Islamic eschatology part. I've never
Okay.
read the books. Herbert or something. Who's the author? Somehow.
Right, right. I think it's Frank Herbert. I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've never read the books. I saw and they're different. There's an original film. Was there a new version of it?
Yes.
So I
Yep.
think I saw the new version, but I
Okay.
remember as a kid it came out and there was some British rock star.
Mhm.
Wasn't it some British rock star was in the movie? Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's not important at all right now. So,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, in terms of my book, it's
Yeah.
not great. It's just a fun little story about an American university kid who was off to Jerusalem. The book is called Jerusalem Secret.
Okay.
And I mean, some of it is just an info dump. It's just like some of the stuff I think about Islam, Christianity, Judaism. The
Okay.
characters just kind of channel my thought, my
Yeah. Yeah.
thoughts. But it's
Okay.
a fun little story. So you can, yeah, find that on Amazon, Jerusalem Secret.
Okay.
More importantly, yeah, it's not anywhere in the same zip code as a book like Dune, as far as
It'll
I
get
know,
there. It'll
because
get there.
yeah, I think I need many lifetimes to be able to write a good book, a good, at least a good fiction, a good novel. So yeah, I mean, from what I understand from the context of the story of
Mhm.
Dune and its connection to Islamic eschatology, um, so the end time story in Islam is about confrontation. Now,
Mhm.
it's there in Christianity as well, of course. In the Book of Revelation and the way that different Christians develop that idea.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's pretty interesting because it returns in a way is more central in Christian thought, especially certain strains of Protestantism that are
Mhm.
really, really interested in kind of rapture end times things.
Mhm.
But I mean, in Islam, the Islamic stories, even though Muslims, I think, generally tend to think about the end times less,
Mhm.
nevertheless, the narrations about the end times are much more dramatic about confrontation.
Mhm.
So, the normal scenario is that Christ will return, but
Mhm.
he will return into a context in which the world is basically at its darkest moment.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, you probably know all this, but you know, there'll be someone who shows up before Jesus returns,
Mhm.
who's known as the Dajjal.
Mhm.
So the deceiver, sometimes actually called El Masih ad-Dajjal, meaning the deceiving Christ. So
Mhm.
basically the Antichrist.
Mhm.
And there'll be all sorts of confusion. You know, this became really important to the rhetoric and the propaganda that ISIS used.
Okay.
You know,
Mhm.
they actually used this end times stuff, which was
Okay.
surprising because most jihadi groups aren't interested in end times things.
Okay. Mhm.
This is why the name of their magazine was Dabiq. You can probably
Okay.
still find it online somewhere. I'm sure you can. And
Okay.
Dabiq is just like it's an obscure little village in Syria, but it's mentioned in some of these narrations as a
Mhm.
site of a battle
Okay.
in the end times.
Mhm.
So anyway, yeah, so Jesus will confront these forces of the Antichrist. There's
Mhm.
very specific narrations about what will go down
Mhm.
with all of that. Um, it's connected also to something in the Quran about Gog and Magog, who are also found, I think, in the Book of Revelation and in the Old Testament, but maybe in a different way.
Mhm.
So I mean, I think the setting of Dune, like it's sort of channeling this dramatic notion of confrontation. And as you
Mhm.
said, the final figure in Islamic eschatology is called the Mahdi. So usually
Mhm.
it's written Mahdi,
Mhm.
and that means something like the rightly guided one.
Mhm.
And he will be a ruler who will bring justice and equity, but also, and probably Herbert didn't channel this part of the story. I
Mhm.
mean, he will basically either spread or enforce or compel a universal adherence to Islam. You know,
Okay.
famously, these narrations say no jizya will be taken anymore, and that's
Mhm.
code for saying you no longer be able to remain a Christian or a Jew by paying this
Right.
tax, the jizya. Your only
Right.
choice will be Islam or death. So
Okay.
the actual narrations, you know, some Muslims don't like them because you know they're not central to the Quran, or even they don't tend to be in the principal hadith books.
Mhm.
So they
Mhm.
would say like, yeah, this stuff, you know,
It's kind of,
that's not my
yeah.
style. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, Dr. Reynolds, I want to thank you again for joining me. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you got to teach and get busy. So I want to thank you for coming on again to answer some of my hot questions and things that I it's been on my mind for a long time. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Yeah, I'm always happy to join you, Shannon. So I hope we can do it again if it's useful. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And Merry Christmas to you.
Thank you. Same to you.
All right.